What if everything you thought you knew about the Holy Land was wrong? What if the true biblical locations, from Eden to Zion, weren't in the Middle East, but deep in the heart of Africa? In this video, we uncover powerful evidence that repositions Africa as the sacred ground of Scripture, prophecy, and divine promise. We trace hidden biblical locations, confront the erasure of truth, and explore the solutions and reparations needed to heal historical wounds. This isn't just history, it's a spiritual awakening. Welcome to Africa is the Holy Land. The truth has been hidden long enough. Let's reveal it together. A sacred map lost in time. For centuries, the idea of the Holy Land has been tethered to the modern Middle East, Israel, Palestine, parts of Jordan, and Egypt. These regions have long been treated as the exclusive geographic backdrop of the Bible. But what if this map is wrong or incomplete? What if the sacred events of Scripture, from Eden to Exodus, from Zion to Revelation, happened not in the so-called Middle East, but in the heart of Africa? This is not a fringe theory. It's a paradigm shift rooted in forgotten scholarship, oral traditions, and suppressed histories. In this exploration, we trace the hidden biblical locations that point back to Africa, reveal how and why they were erased from mainstream theology, and present the urgent solutions and reparations necessary to restore truth and dignity to African people across the world. Part 1. Africa in the Bible. Hiding in plain sight. The Bible mentions Africa more than most realize, but through centuries of Western interpretation, these connections have been overlooked or intentionally obscured. Kush, modern-day Sudan/Ethiopia, Mizraim, ancient Kemet or Egypt, and Sheba, possibly in modern-day Ethiopia or Yemen, are all African nations named directly in the Scriptures. These were not minor characters on the biblical stage. They were nations of kings, prophets, warriors, and wisdom keepers. 1 Eden in Africa? Genesis 2 verses 10 to 14 gives geographical clues about the Garden of Eden, including the rivers Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. The Gihon is described as the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. Cush is undeniably associated with Africa, particularly the region now known as Sudan or Ethiopia. Some scholars argue that Eden, or at least its boundaries, may have stretched into Africa. Moreover, the ancient presence of the Nile and other river systems matches the description of rivers flowing from Eden. African oral traditions also tell of a primeval garden, a place of origin and divine communion. 2. Mount Sinai and the Exodus route. Traditionally, Mount Sinai is placed in the Sinai Peninsula, but alternative theories suggest that it may lie deeper in Africa, possibly in the Ethiopian highlands. Ethiopian Christians, one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, preserve traditions about the Ark of the Covenant being brought to Aksum by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. If the Ark was in Ethiopia, could Mount Zion and other holy places be there too? The famous Ethiopian Kebra Nagast presents an alternate but compelling timeline of biblical history, centered entirely within African geography. Part 2. Zion in Africa, the case for a sacred homeland. Zion is one of the most sacred concepts in the Bible, symbolizing both a physical location and a spiritual ideal. While modern interpretations place Zion squarely in Jerusalem, ancient Ethiopian texts and Rastafarian teachings identify Zion as Ethiopia. This is not a modern invention. Psalm 68 verse 31 says, "Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God." This verse, celebrated by African-descended people for generations, hints at a future where Africa reclaims her spiritual destiny. The presence of ancient Judaic traditions among African tribes, from the Beta Israel of Ethiopia to the Lemba of southern Africa, suggests that Africa was not just influenced by Israelite religion, but was an integral part of the biblical world. Part 3. Colonial Cartography and the Theft of Sacred Geography. How did Africa's biblical role get erased? The answer lies in the colonial project, which sought to disconnect African people from their ancient identities, cultures, and spiritual histories. When Europe colonized Africa, it also colonized time and space. It renamed lands, redefined narratives, and relocated spiritual centers to fit a Eurocentric worldview. This colonial cartography systematically removed Africa from the story of salvation. European powers redrew maps to marginalize Africa, both physically and theologically. They labeled African civilizations as pagan, tribal, and pre-literate, even though many of them had oral traditions, sophisticated languages, temples, and spiritual systems older than much of Europe. Even the term Middle East is a colonial invention. It was created to separate North Africa from the rest of the continent and create a buffer zone for European interests. Biblical geography was shaped to suit politics, not truth. Part 4. Why this matters: Identity, Dignity, and Power. Reclaiming Africa as the Holy Land is not merely a historical correction. It's a revolution in identity. For centuries, African people were told they were cursed, misinterpreting the curse of Ham, that their role in the Bible was minimal or servile, and that Christianity was a European import. But the truth is that African soil nurtured the spiritual foundations of Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam. To recognize this is to break the chains of spiritual colonialism. When black children are taught that God walked on their land, that prophets emerged from their soil, and that sacred rivers flowed through their valleys, they grow with a sense of divine worth. This rediscovery can heal the wounds of slavery, colonization, and racism, not by revenge, but by restoration. Part 5. The role of Ethiopia, guardian of the Ark. Ethiopia stands as a shining example of Africa's ancient spiritual authority. It was never colonized. It houses some of the oldest churches in the world, and it guards, according to tradition, the Ark of the Covenant in a small church in Aksum. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained biblical traditions for over a millennium. Their Bible contains books that Western Bibles removed, such as the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and 1 Maccabean, all of which expand the biblical world beyond the limited narrative we've inherited. Enoch, for example, is deeply connected to African cosmology. Some traditions say he ascended from the Ethiopian mountains, not far from where the Nile begins. Part 6. Solutions: Education, Spiritual Awakening, and Cultural Reclamation. Biblical Re-Education. Seminaries, schools, and churches must begin re-examining biblical geography. Maps, interpretations, and commentaries should be revisited through the lens of African contributions and locations. Public access to African biblical scholarship. African scholars, theologians, and spiritual leaders must be supported to share their knowledge globally. Oral traditions should be preserved and published, and ancient manuscripts, like those in Ethiopia, digitized for the world to see. Spiritual decolonization. Churches in Africa and the diaspora must reconnect to their indigenous spiritual roots without shame. Christianity in Africa didn't begin with colonial missionaries. It began in the book of Acts, when the Ethiopian eunuch was baptized by Philip. Cultural exchange and pilgrimage. Spiritual tourism should extend beyond Jerusalem and Rome to places like Lalibela, Aksum, and the great Zimbabwe ruins. Pilgrimages to African holy sites will reshape global faith consciousness. Part 7. Reparations: Restoring the Sacred Legacy. When sacred land is stolen, reparations aren't just economic. They are spiritual. The erasure of Africa from the biblical narrative robbed millions of their spiritual heritage. The repair must be holistic. Reparations for miseducation. Institutions that promoted colonial theology must invest in African theological education and republish censored works. Return of stolen manuscripts and artifacts. European museums must return stolen religious texts and artifacts to African nations and communities. Reconnection of diaspora communities. African-descended communities in the Americas and Caribbean must be given access to their spiritual roots through education, pilgrimage, and cultural exchange. Acknowledgement by religious authorities. Major denominations must issue statements acknowledging Africa's role in biblical history and the damage caused by centuries of erasure. A truth hidden in plain sight. For generations, the map of sacred history has pointed us in one direction, toward modern-day Israel, parts of Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, collectively referred to as the Middle East. These lands have been labeled the Holy Land, revered as the geographical heart of the Abrahamic faiths. But what if that map is incomplete? What if the foundations of the Bible, the cradle of divine encounter, and the rivers of Eden flowed not eastward, but southward into Africa? To suggest that Africa is the true Holy Land is not to erase history, but to correct its course. It is not about rewriting the Bible, but rereading it with fresh eyes, unburdened by centuries of colonial influence, Western theology, and geopolitical interests. In doing so, we don't just change our understanding of geography. We restore a sacred identity long denied to the African continent and its descendants. This is the story of rediscovery, of truth long buried, of power, dignity, and destiny. And yes, the world must know. Africa and the Bible, a forgotten relationship. The Bible is filled with references to African places, people, and kingdoms. Yet traditional theology often treats these mentions as footnotes rather than foundations. This erasure is not coincidental. It reflects centuries of colonial and Eurocentric rewriting of sacred geography. Cush, Mizraim, and the lineage of nations. In Genesis 10, we read of Noah's sons and their descendants. Among them is Cush, the son of Ham, whose territory scholars consistently link to regions in modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. Mizraim, often equated with ancient Egypt, is also listed. These aren't mythical lands. They're African. Even the famous Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 mentions the river Gin, which is said to compass the whole land of Cush. This is a massive clue. If Cush is in Africa, and the river of Eden surrounds it, then part of Eden, perhaps all of it, must have been located on African soil. So why have we not been taught this? The colonial cartography of faith. Colonialism didn't just conquer land, it conquered memory, myth, and map. European powers during the 18th and 19th centuries were not interested in elevating African history or spirituality. To justify their missions, both military and religious, they had to present Africa as a dark, uncivilized continent needing light. In that narrative, African kingdoms were demoted, their spiritual systems deemed pagan, and their connections to sacred history erased. Maps were redrawn. Archaeological evidence was ignored or repurposed. Even theological seminaries in Europe and America reinforced the myth that the Bible unfolded in a world entirely separate from Africa. And thus, the Middle East was born, not as a historical reality, but a geopolitical fiction that removed Africa from the divine timeline. Ethiopia, the spiritual stronghold. Long before Europe embraced Christianity, Ethiopia was already immersed in it. By the 4th century CE, Ethiopia declared Christianity its official religion, making it one of the oldest Christian nations in the world. But Ethiopia's spiritual significance goes back even further. The Queen of Sheba and Solomon. The legendary Queen of Sheba, mentioned in 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9, is believed by many to be from Ethiopia or Yemen. She visited King Solomon bearing gold, spices, and wisdom. The Ethiopian epic Cradle recounts that she bore Solomon a son, Menelik I, who would return to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. To this day, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians believe the Ark resides in Aksum. Why is this not common knowledge? Because it places the most sacred object in Judeo-Christian history not in Jerusalem, but in Africa. The Ethiopian eunuch, Africa's first Christian convert. In the New Testament, Acts 8 verses 26 to 39, an angel sends Philip to meet an Ethiopian eunuch, a high official in the queen's court, who is reading Isaiah. After discussing the passage, the eunuch is baptized and continues on his journey. This makes him one of the earliest known Christian converts. This single act proves something profound. Christianity was rooted in Africa from the beginning, not brought by European missionaries centuries later. Mount Zion, Sinai, and African sacred spaces. Mount Sinai is traditionally identified in the Sinai Peninsula, but some alternative theories, based on ancient routes, topography, and oral traditions, suggest it could be in the Ethiopian highlands or East African Rift. The same applies to Zion, often associated with Jerusalem. But for Ethiopians, Zion is not metaphorical, it is real. The city of Aksum, the Ark's resting place, is known by some as New Jerusalem. The churches of Lalibela, carved directly into rock in the 12th century, reflect biblical blueprints, including a River Jordan and a Mount Zion. These aren't imitations. They are ancient representations of a sacred geography rooted in African soil. Oral traditions, carriers of sacred memory. Long before written scripture, African societies preserved history through oral tradition. These weren't fairy tales, they were complex, precise systems of remembering genealogy, migration, prophecy, and sacred law. Many African oral traditions speak of divine visitors, cosmic battles, floods, and divine mountains, all themes mirrored in the Bible. Could these be localized reflections of the same events? Or perhaps, did the biblical writers themselves draw from older African spiritual knowledge? While Western academia often dismissed oral tradition as unreliable, today more scholars recognize its depth and value. In fact, it may be the missing link between Scripture and its true setting. Reparations, restoring sacred memory. To claim Africa as the Holy Land is not merely about geographical truth, it's about justice. The theft of sacred geography was part of a larger robbery, of dignity, of identity, of divine connection. 1. Educational reparations. Curricula in seminaries, universities, and schools must be corrected. African biblical scholarship should be funded and elevated. Ancient African texts, like the Book of Enoch, Jubilees, and Cradle, should be restored to their rightful place in religious studies. 2. Spiritual reconnection. African-descended people around the world must be given space to reconnect with their sacred heritage. This is more than cultural. It is healing. It is a homecoming. Diaspora communities, especially in the Caribbean, North America, and Latin America, have a right to know that they are not just descendants of slaves, but of prophets, priests, and kings. 3. Return of sacred artifacts. Many of Africa's religious artifacts and manuscripts remain locked in European museums. These must be returned, not just as historical relics, but as living vessels of faith. From Ethiopian scrolls to Nubian crosses to West African cosmologies, these are the keys to restoring spiritual heritage. Why the world must know. We live in a time of spiritual amnesia. People search for identity in a world that has erased their past. But once you realize that Africa is the true Holy Land, something shifts. You understand that the sacred didn't come to Africa. It came from Africa. This realization transforms how we see ourselves, how we read the Bible, and how we relate to the divine. Africa as the Holy Land is not just an African truth. It is a human truth. If Eden was in Africa, then all humanity originated on sacred ground. If the rivers of life flowed through Ethiopia and Sudan, then all nations drink from the same spiritual source. If Zion lies in Aksum, then salvation has a new address, one that demands our reverence and our return. Rediscovering the divine within. This journey is not about tearing down the faith traditions we've known. It's about enriching them. It's about recognizing that the Bible is not a European story. It is a global story, with Africa at its heart. When we trace the rivers of Eden, the footsteps of the prophets, and the echoes of divine encounter, we find they do not lead east, they lead south. To the highlands of Ethiopia, to the temples of Sudan, to the rock churches of Lalibela, to the sacred memory carried in black bodies, black songs, black rituals. To rediscover Africa as the Holy Land is to rediscover ourselves, our power, our dignity, our divine inheritance. It is time. The world must know. If Africa is the true Holy Land, then history must be rewritten, and justice must be served. We've traced the ancient paths, revealed sacred locations, and exposed the silence surrounding Africa's divine role. But this journey isn't over, it's just beginning. The call for solutions and reparations is not about revenge, but restoration. It's time to reclaim what was taken, to honor what was hidden, and to remember what was sacred. If this truth stirred something in you, like, share, and subscribe. Join us as we continue uncovering the forgotten truths. Africa is holy, and the world needs to know.